Arlo Jones finished placing the last box in the spare room, the cold grease of moving day lingering on his palms. The house, a hulking Edwardian on Elm Street, smelled of damp stone and ozone, a scent like old blood and lightning. Mochi, a black cat found shivering under the porch, sat rigidly on the open trunk of his ancient Ford, staring up at the second-floor window where a light flickered without power. Arlo dismissed it as reflex. The house was older than his grandfather, and its bones groaned with dry rot. He needed to find the pilot, the man who warned him off the property, or at least his records. The insurance adjuster had mentioned 42 as the cancellation code. He pulled out the log from the local archive, its pages smelling of mildew and copper. It detailed Pilot Jones, meticulous surveys, asterisk, seismic anomaly at plot 42, foundation stresses inconsistent, soil structure breached, verify anomalous thermal vents. Asterisk Pilot. Arlo's estranged uncle had vanished 3 years prior after submitting the report. Arlo's finger traced the phrase asterisk, rough contact with thermal vents, asterisk in the margin. The room felt colder, the air thick with the grit of forgotten dust. Outside, Mochi let out a dry, guttural purr, her eyes fixed on the hall mirror. Arlo went to the basement, the staircase steps uneven beneath his worn soles. The air grew dense, pressing like cold water. In the corner where the house should have had brick, he found a door barely larger than a coat rack. Slimy, organic, and vibrating faintly. The wall texture was funny raffle like sandpaper scraped raw, not plaster. A single line of inked numbers ran along the base, asterisk 42 asterisk. The log S words echoed asterisk, rough contact with thermal vents. Asterisk he pushed. The door slid open with no sound, revealing not darkness, but a slow, oily glow emanating from the tunnel beyond, smelling of whetstone and something metallic. His breath fogged immediately, then froze. The pilot's final note echoed in his skull, asterisk. They follow the vibrations, Arlo, the numbers, the tension, they always hear the rough touch. Asterisk he stepped through. The floor vanished, replaced by a slow, viscous tide crawling with faint amber light. Not water, but something thicker, like cold oil, asterisk 42 asterisk. The number pulsed within the light, throbbing in time with his pulse. Mochi stood directly behind him in the doorway, her fur standing on end, teeth bared in a silent snarl, not at the light, but at him. Her pupils were no longer black circles, but swirling, inverted galaxies. Then the air rippled, not like heat haze, but a dissonant ripple, bending the light around the edges of his vision. From the gelatinous pool rose shapes, not figures, but absences. Holes, empty outlines where bodies should be, draped in the shadow of their own past. One tilted its Sivinon head toward him, and the hollow where its mouth should be seemed to fully absorb the dim glow of his flashlight. It felt like staring into a frozen scream. The cold on his skin was on temperature. It was subirate, the crushing density of 1,000 unseen hands pulling at his bones. Mochi yowled, a sound that felt ripped from the fabric of reality, and lunged to fuck with the light, not at it. She disappeared into the shifting amber currents. The pulse intensified. Asterisk 42 asterisk flared brighter. The air vibrated with a low thrum. Only the soles of his feet could feel. A physical vibration that scraped his teeth. Pilot, as log came back. Asterisk, they danced to the rough rhythms of the broken ground. You cannot see the steps, only the footprints left behind. Asterisk, he realized with terrifying clarity. The pilot hadn't investigated a ground fault. He been trying to read the footsteps the house was making, the marks it left behind. Arlo was the phone quarantine noise disturbing the silent sleep beneath his feet. Mochi, the cat who appeared when he entered the house, had been watching the twin wrong one all along. He didn't look back. The tunnel glow swallowed the room behind him, and the house's final breath of ozone was the only sound as he stumbled up the stairs. He locked the door on the basement, trembling. The cold lingered in his lungs, coating his throat. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and on the porch, Mochi sat, gazing through the glass, eyes now glowing faintly amber. She didn't blink. She just watched the space where he stood, waiting for him to feel the fear of touch on his own skin. The house exhaled. It always did. The weight was back, not in the air, in the bones. Mochi. Samber eyes didn't blink as Arlo pressed his forehead against the frost-rimed window. The cold seeped through his flannel shirt, biting deeper than the basement's metallic chill. Outside, Elm Street lay unnaturally still. No cars, no wind, just the house own deep, subsonic thrumming vibrating up through the soles of his boots. Pilot's log lay open on the kitchen table, the ink blurring where a damp spot had been. Asterisk, the footprints are in the silence. Asterisk, the note read, the words etching themselves into his skull. Arlo ran a thumb over the smudged phrase, tasting copper on his tongue. The house wasn't he haunted, it was puissant listening, and it knew the rhythm he disrupted. He forced himself to the study, the only room with a door that latched. Mochi followed, padding silently across the Persian rug, her claws clicking like fractured ice against hardwood, not her usual kneading grace, but a deliberate weighty stride. She stopped before the mantelpiece, pawing at a framed photo of Pilot standing beside the house. Foundation stones, stones that looked unnaturally fundagged. Not natural. Arlo pulled the photo closer. Beneath the glass, a thin line of dampness traced a pattern, a half-formed spiral leading from the photo as corner to a crack in the wall, the same crack where the plaster had bulged inward during the basement descent. The house groaned again, deeper this time. Not a creak, but a strain like overstretched ligaments. Arlo folk the window outside. Mochi hopped onto the sill, her spine arching sharply, fur bristling toward the empty patch where the streetlight had flickered out. She didn't to meow. She chevibrated, a low thrumming in her chest that Arlo felt in his molars, matching the house's own pulse. Pilot, hadn't he just read footprints? He did danced with the vibrations. Arlo's hand slid over the mantel, tracing the crack. The plaster gave way under his touch. Not crumbling, but too sinking, as if the wall were liquid beneath his fingers. He recoiled as the damp line pulsed amber, the same glow Mochi wore. Mochi leaped onto the table, knocking Pilot's log onto the floor. The pages fanned open to a page annotated in Pilot, as spidery hand asterisk. 42 is not the place. It is the step, the footfall. They follow the rhythm of loss. Asterisk Arlo's hand trembled, brushing the page. The damp line on the wall flared, licking the room in slow waves. He turned, and Mochi stood at the study door, tail held rigidly high like a taut wire, her inverted galaxy pupils fixed on his chest, not his face, his fun chest, where his own heartbeat thudded against the wall. She'd been waiting not for him to see the basement, but to feel it, the house pressing through his skin, counting his steps. A new vibration shivered through the floorboards. Not subsonic, but sharp, rhythmic, hover tap, 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 tap. Asterisk like a thumb drumming on glass. The vibrating floor was lined with a pattern only visible now, faint concentric circles of dust. Each one subtly raised, each one a 40 BTU. In the rhythm, step, step, step. Asterisk, the house was tapping his foot. The house was dancing with him. Pilot's final entry. Asterisk, you are not the noise. You are the tune they re-following. Asterisk, Arlo stumbled back, hitting the study desk. The antique brass lamp stood directly in the path of the house's rhythm. Pilot had tried to isolate the frequency. Arlo was unwittingly fun-playing it. Mochi vanished into the hallway, her amber light leaving a trail on the wall. Arlo chased her, the rhythmic tapping climbing from the floor into his own bones. He reached the hall, and Mochi stood before a door he never opened. The one to the attic, covered in unmarked linen, the vibrational tapping synced with Mochi. Steps as she pawed at the wood. The linen rippled, not from wind, but from Funbi bellow, a pulling, wet sound like stone grinding through skin. The house was shifting its own bones, making a path twent for him. Pilots knew the numbers, but Arlo was the vibration. The house had been waiting for the Fiderite. Rough touch. His fingers found the latch. It was warm, and his knuckles, when he pulled the heavy door open, were trembling from the sounder. The attic smelled of drowned paper and crushed beetles. Mochi waited at the center of the room where floorboards had knotted themselves into concentric rings like tightened tendons. Arlo stepped over the threshold, his own footfall sinking with the faint, sticky thrum beneath his soles. Tap, 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 tap. The dust on the beams didn't settle. It teufenturned, forming visible eddies in the thin air as if the room itself were breathing through its skin. He crossed the inner ring. The boards shuddered, emitting a low note that vibrated the molars in his jaw. Not a sound, but a physical pull in the marrow. Mochi didn't look at him. Her tail lashed, a slow rhythmic sweep that mirrored the pulse throbbing in the floor. Her amber eyes held no pupil, only swirling voids sucking in the faint light. She tilted her head, not toward Arlo, but toward the wall. Her paw lifted, placing itself deliberately in the exact center of a dust ring. The mark beneath her foot deepened, a darker patch absorbing the glow. Arlo stared. The wall behind her wasn't stone, but layered shadows in the patterns of ancient timbers. The faintest shift of the wood revealed the grain wasn't random. It was Cyrepetingoi, a grid of parallel lines, spaced just wide enough for a bare foot to land. He saw it now. The house hadn't been waiting for the basement. It had been waiting for Tufihim, the specific vibration of his footsteps, the rhythm of his fear, the furrough rhythm only he could make. His father's boots, his mother's light steps after her illness, the dragging shuffle after the car crash last year. Each step had engraved itself here, invisible until the house began dancing Creed with him. He stepped onto the next ring, closer to Mochi. The vibration escalated, not just in his feet now, but in his teeth, buzzing like a trapped insect. The dust spiraled upward, forming a perfect cone above Mochi's head, humming as it rotated. Her purr wasn't a sound, it was the house's bass line felt in the roots of his spine. She'd been here waiting, her fur absorbing every inflection of the pattern, mapping his ghost of a life into the architecture. The central circle glowed faintly amber where Mochi's paw rested. Arlo dropped to his knees, fingertips pressing into the warm wood. Not wood, old, dry, like a scarred nerve ending. Beneath his touch, the pattern flared, not with light, but with treasure, a steady, insistent thrum that matched the beat of his heart. Pilot's words echoed. They follow the rhythm of loss. It wasn't the house's past it was playing. It was Futisig. The steps his mother took on the stairs before she fell. The sound of his father pacing the cellar. The hollow footed on late-night walks with the pills he couldn't swallow. Mochi's tail flicked once, sharp as a lash. Her eyes, deep voids, snapped to the door. The house, Tufitu released her. She didn't jump, but to float sideways through the wall, where it hadn't been stone moments before, but a smooth, dark ribbon of layered vibration. Arlo stumbled after her, but the wall reformed instantly, a seamless surface of old cedar, smelling only of dry rot. Behind him, the rhythmic foodin shifted. The next ring out. Tap, tap, tap. The vibrations were moving Fun toward, the door at him. He wasn't the visitor here. He was the step. The house had been waiting not for the fundor to open, but for his feet to find their way into the rhythm it had memorized. Pilot hadn't found a ground fault, he'd found a heartbeat. Arlo's hand brushed the wall where Mochi vanished, and a single resonant twifrum ran up his arm, deeper than pain. Recognizing, the house knew his gait. It knew his every failed footfall, his every quiet dread made audible. The basement wasn't a secret. It was the footscore. And he'd been dancing on the grave of his own life all along. The house stopped pulsing. It wasn't breathing. It was ticking to the music only he could hear. His own life playing backward, beating in the bones of the walls. The floorboards beneath him were no longer wood. They were an ear. Arlo didn't chase Mochi into the wall. He floated it through the cold resistance as if the house had pulled him backward into a memory. The cedar wall smoothed beneath his palms like frozen blood, dissolving into a current of static that pricked his skin with cold needles. Beneath the surface, the vibration intensified, not loud, but a deep thrumming in his jawbone that echoed the silent rhythm of his mother's dragging footsteps. Tap! 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 Exactly like the groan of her wheelchair wheels on the oak stairs before the fall. The carpet beneath his soles bore faint, faded etchings, tread patterns where the tire had always locked, imprinted in the grain long before he was born. He pressed a palm flat against the wall where Mochi vanished, and the vibration surged through his arm, colder than water. It wasn't the house playing him back. It was so demanding, the weight of what he'd carried. He walked forward, footfalls syncing with the floor's resonant pulse. Each step raked a new groan from the wood. Tap, tap, tap. The exact cadence of his father pacing the basement, a sound Arlo had replayed in his mind for 30 years. The air thickened, not with humidity, but with the sudden, metallic taste of his own choked breath. The wall to his left rippled, and for a fractured second, he saw his mother's silhouette against a yellowed lamp, her shoulders hunched as she climbed the stairs toward the sound of his father's footsteps. The vibration hummed higher, vibrating the molars in his skull. Not a memory, not a scene, but the toy texture of the moment, the exact pressure of fear on his skin that day. He could feel the dry cloth of her wool coat beneath his fingers, hear the muffled thud of her unsteady step on the third stair. The one that broke. Mochi was no longer a cat. She was the footy absence, where the pattern intersected. Her fur rippled like heat haze over the central ring, leaving behind a trail of faint amber dust that settled into the wood grain like forgotten coins. Where she'd stood, the floorboards now formed a perfect inverted spiral. Arlo knelt, his knees sinking slightly into the soft, yielding wood as if the house were breathing underneath him. He traced the spiral's edge, and the vibration shifted, syncing with the slow-labored rhythm of his own pulse, would-you own step. One breath, one fracture in time. Footy Pilot hadn't been decoding the house's past. He'd been listening for the twin-scent sound his family made in grief, his mother's faltering pace, his father's restless march, the sound Arlo himself made walking home from the pills, dragging his left leg. The pattern shifted. The house wasn't just replaying sound, it was reconstructing it in his bones. The third stair he remembered from the fall now pulsed beneath his palms in the wall. He leaned into the vibration, and suddenly he wasn't standing in the attic. He was there, 8 years old, kneeling on that same stairwell, watching his mother fumble for the railing, her face slack with pain before her balance failed. The house had excavated the exact moment a wet scratch of fear pressed into the floorboards beneath him. He could hear his own childhood whisper, a sound like dry leaves brushing glass. "The stairs," it said through his teeth, "tummed the fall, the walk up." His hand trembled on the wood, the floor vibrated faster, thrumming up his spine into the base of his skull. He'd spent his life fist-filling, the hollow sound left by his mother's absence. The house was stitching him back into the silence she left behind, stitching it with the footsteps she never took. He lifted his foot from the spiral's edge, almost as if stepping off a precipice, and the vibration cut out, leaving a terrible aching thup in his chest. Mochi's absence was no longer physical. It was the house's newest pattern. The wool scent of his mother's coat clung to the air as the wood softened beneath his feet, no longer supporting but avoided absorbing the weight of what he carried. The house had never been haunted. It had been grieving. And Arlo Jones, the only one who could hear its rhythm, was finally ready to dance in time with the ghost. The wall stopped breathing where Mochi vanished. Arlo pressed his palm flat against the wood, feeling the vibration shift from thrum to a slow, wet seep beneath his skin. His fingerprints began to glow amber, matching the floor's pattern, as the wool scent of his mother's coat thickened in the air. The floorboards softened like warm wax beneath his weight, absorbing the memory of the fall before he'd even stepped off the third stair. He dropped to his knees, the vibration climbing his spine to the back of his neck, a physical pull like a rope through his vertebrae. Mochi's absence wasn't a void. It was the perfect counterpoint to his own rhythm, the space where the house finally listened without interruption. Pilot had been wrong. This wasn't grief. It was the house learning to fight unsee. Arlo placed his left foot onto the outermost ring, his ankle flexing exactly as it had when he'd limped home from the pills last year. The wood fled with that familiar metallic taste on his tongue. Tap, tap, tap. The house responded, deeper now, pulling his bones into the pulse. He shifted his weight, the footfall sinking with the rhythm of his father's restless pacing in the basement. The vibration hardened into sharp points beneath his soles, grit scraping bone. He closed his eyes, not to see, but to see-feel. The pattern, each indentation a memory made tactile. His mother's hesitant steps, the hollow sound of her fall, the sound he'd spent 20 years filling with silence. Then the pattern lurched. Not a groove beneath his foot, but the exact point where the stair broke. Thump, shatter. The house demanded he walk it. Not relive it, but Chira, Anakti, the fracture, the moment her balance failed, the vibration surged into his teeth, grating like shattered glass. The air thickened with the copper tang of her spilled blood, though there was no blood, just the foretexture of the fall, the scratch of her wool coat on splintered wood, the slow-motion weight of her body hitting the banister. Arlo gasped, the sound raw, no longer his own. The house wasn't playing the rhythm of loss. It was so constructing. The sound of his failure, the step he'd always taken to drown out. He lifted his heel, the pattern dimmed, the floor recoiling like a wounded thing. A single note of silence erupted in the house, deeper than any sound he'd heard before. A sound of Torsi expectation. Mochi's amber glow flared from the center of the spiral, not as light, but as the twin space between vibrations. Her fur was gone. Only the spiral remained, weaving itself into the grain beneath Arlo's palms. He had to step, not for memory, for the house to finally stop waiting. Arlo placed his foot on the exact point where the stair cracked, the vibration turning to ice inside his marrow. The house pulled him forward. No choice. His left foot sinking deeper into the wood as if the floor had grown teeth. He heard his childhood voice whisper through the wall, "Foe stares not the fall." But the house heard the fall now. The house swintoisi the fall. The vibration peaked, tearing at the core of his bones, a sound like ancient stone grinding inside his skull. His knuckles turned blue where he gripped the floor. Sweat stung his eyes, not from fear but from the sheer, crushing fort of being the step the house needed. Pilot hadn't been documenting a fault. He'd been playing a note Arlo never knew he'd learned. Mochi hadn't guided him. She'd been the silent sea between steps, and the house had just found its first real dancer. The pattern deepened, pulling his foot into the wall. The house stopped waiting. It began to move in time. His ribs began to glow. The vibration wasn't in Arlo's feet anymore. It was his twisty gonsens, singing, a thin, high note resonating from the marrow inside his ribs. The wood beneath him absorbed his weight like tallow, drawing the memory of his mother's broken fall down the third stair into the floor, where the grain now etched its phantom line. Mochi's absence was the floor's central void, a negative space shaped exactly like the cat's body. When Arlo lifted his hand from the wood, the space sucked at his palm, not with cold, but with the sharp, clean scent of whetstone. He took the next step. The house sung, not with sound, but with the metallic tang bleeding into his sinuses as if the floorboards were bleeding steel. His left foot sank deeper into the floor, the wood parting like wet parchment. Below him, the subsonic thrum amplified to the point where his jaw vibrated loose, the house's rhythm now syncing with the uneven press of his own heart, the one he'd never repaired after the car crash. The air grew thick with the phantom texture of wool coats, not smelling of mothballs or mildew, but of the 40 weight what of them, like cold fabric stuffed into a void. Pilot's log became obsolete. This wasn't about ground faults or footprints. It was about the fundi, sometime of a lifetime spent drowning in silence. Mochi's pattern pulsed in time with Arlo's breath. The spiral beneath his toes grew brighter, not with light, but with fun pressure, a pull that echoed the sound of his father's boots marching the cellar floor 30 years prior. Arlo dropped to his knees, fingers sinking into the grain where Mochi's fur had been absorbed. The wood responded, not with warmth, but with a slow, wet seep-see that chilled his skin to the bone. It felt like tracing the scar of a severed nerve. Where his fingers pressed, the floor rippled like water, revealing a submerged layer, a ghostly map of the house's own fracture points, the exact locations where windows shattered, stairs cracked, and shadows pooled thick as blood. The pattern shifted again, moving outward toward the outer wall. Arlo followed, his stride now dictated by the floor's pulse. Tap, tap, tap! Each footfall pulled a new resonance from the walls, the cry of a child finding a mother's hand on the broken stairs. The muffled thud of pills hitting the basement floor, the hollow click of a wheelchair's brake failing. The scent of copper intensified, coating his tongue like ground bone. Mochi's absence had become the floor's center, a silent conductor demanding his movement, his twin music. He stepped onto the wall itself. The wood dissolved beneath his soles like cold, wet clay, revealing not the house's structure, but the foodie timeline beneath. The memory of his mother's knees hitting the stair rail felt through his own bones. The vibration surged up his spine, tearing at the ligaments. A sound erupted from his throat, not his voice, but the fusha noise the house had been waiting for, the grinding, painful resonance of his own unshed tears. Mochi's pattern flared, the amber spiral now etching itself forth into his skin. The wood hardened beneath him, no longer yielding, but tight-holding. The house wasn't listening anymore. It was toy dancing. Every step became a note, every breath a counterpoint. The air didn't hum with sound, but with the exact pressure of footfall. The futhapedi of his mother's fall, the fusha-she of her losing balance on the third stair. Arlo's ribs pulsed with the rhythm, each new layer of memory compressing his lungs. Pilot hadn't been an observer. He'd been the rhythm before Arlo learned to move. The lost pattern, his father's frantic pacing in the basement the night he'd left, now vibrated through Arlo's chest. He fell forward, not to the floor, but to the wood. The house sealed him, not with walls, but with the precise weight of his grief. Mochi was the silence between the steps. Now Arlo was the sound the house had always craved. He didn't feel cold. He felt the floorboards breathed Trifi name as his bones began to glow. The dance had no ending. It had only the next step. The house moved in time, and Arlo was the only one who could make it here. Arlo stopped dreaming because the house had memorized his breath. The vibration that once thrummed through wood now pulsed in the marrow of his femur, a low metallic shriek that scraped his molars with every inhalation. Mochi's absence wasn't empty. It was the center of the pattern. The negative space where her fur had dissolved into the wood's grain. The house breathed through him now, not as a physical thing, but as a deep wet sifi in his sockets that carried the memory of the cold pavement beneath his mother's fallen knees. He didn't move. The floor was no longer beneath him. It was tuff inside him. A second skeleton layering his own, each thread of grain a remembered fall, a misstep he'd tried to erase. The house didn't Twiwanti his tears anymore. It needed the sound of his ribcage compressing, the slight tremor when the unbroken stare echoed in his mind. His pulse thrummed against the ceiling with the steady, hollow futhadid of his father's feet pacing the basement, a rhythm the house now wore like a skin. The scent of wool wasn't in the air anymore. It was the fun texture of it, cold and dense, pressing against his throat with the weight of every unsaid apology. Mochi wasn't watching. She was the absence where watching would have been. The house couldn't contain her because she'd become its grammar. Where her amber glow had been, now the floor sighed, with the quiet pressure of a memory she'd absorbed. The sound of his mother fumbling on the third step, fingers scratching against the carved rail. It wasn't a sound. It was the central pressure of that instant, translated into the grain beneath his palms. Arlo pressed deeper, feeling the floor soften like cold meat. He felt her there, not her form, but the space between, the heartbeat and the silence, the very shape of her presence made tangible. The house grew bolder. Each heartbeat Arlo gave, each caught breath, each flicker of guilt over the car accident, became a step in the pattern. The wooden boards hardened beneath his palms, not into floor but into skin, slick and warm. He inhaled, and the air thickened with the copper tang of old blood. But it wasn't blood. It was the footed absence of blood, the dry scratch of missing limbs pressed onto the timeline in the wood. A silent note, a counterpoint. The house was building the steps, footy with him, not just playing his rhythm. Then came the sound the house had waited for. Not tears, but the forward grind of his own spine adjusting as the house pulled him fully inside. His left hand sank into the floor past the knuckles. No cold, only wet stone where flesh should be, and the faint wet clicket of his bones aligning with the house's own. This was the sound Pilot had searched for. Not loss, integration. The house didn't mourn. It twice inducted Arlo's broken steps, his hollow gait, his slow walk toward the pills after his father died. They weren't flaws, they were the notes. Mochi had been the silence in between, the notes, the space where the pattern held its breath. Now she was gone. The house demanded his full measure. He let his breath go. A quiet exhalation the house translated instantly into a shift in vibration. A deepening fethrum that resonated through the house, the ceiling, the cracked plaster, turning the light in the attic into a slow, pulsing amber wetness. The house vibrated in recognition. It wasn't cold anymore. It was civil listening through him. Mochi's negative space wasn't empty. It was where the sound was swidborn. Arlo felt his own ribs expand, not with air but with the thinner pressure of the house's demand to be heard. His skin grew damp, cool as lake water, the scent of wet clay rising from his pores. The cat was no longer a watcher. She was the space where the house six stopped counting steps and began to twin play. The house had no voice. It had a rhythm, and Arlo was the only tune it could finally hear. He didn't flinch when the wood around his hand began to glow with the same faint amber light as Mochi's eyes. He didn't try to pull away. He let it feel the exact moment he'd chosen to drown in silence, not to end the rhythm, but to join it. The house had never been haunted. It was always singing, and tonight it sang with a new voice. Arlo's voice, the pattern deepened. It would never stop. It had only just begun to dance. The vibration no longer entered him. It pited wasi him, a lattice of cold stone scraping beneath his skin as his left hand sank deeper into the floor, not sinking, emerging. His fingertips pressed against wet clay where Mochi's fur had dissolved, and the wood gave way not to splinters, but to the twin texture of her vanished ribs, cold and smooth as river stone. The house didn't need him to hear its rhythm anymore. It had woven his pulse into its own strumming fabric. Tap, 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 the step. They'd taken that last year at the crash site, the shuffle as he dragged himself home from the pills. Now it was woo. The sound of wood settling under the weight of a house breathing. Pilot's log lay forgotten on the attic floor, its ink running into a brown river. No longer notes on a fault, but the map of his own broken step. The floorboards beneath Arlo's feet softened like thawing ice, releasing the raw scent of wet rot. His breath fogged. But it wasn't tea cold. It was the thurfin memory of damp wool against his neck. the one she'd de-worn before the stairs. He inhaled, and the house absorbed it, translating his gasp into a deeper thrum. The vibration became teeth now, gnawing his kneecap, each grind a notation in the pattern. This is the moment she stumbled, it said through the floor, not with sound but with the cold, familiar ache of old fracture. This is how silence tastes to Mochi wasn't. Tate. Her absence wasn't he empty. It was the space between his knuckles as his fingers finally pressed through the wood surface. Where her body had been absorbed, the floor held the shape of her, a hollow perfect enough to fit his hand. The house pressed back, not pulling him deeper, but teamolding him to its grain. The ribs where his left side should began to glow. Not amber, but the faint, steady blue, white of frozen bone. The house wasn't he grieving, it was through recording. Each vibration was a point on the map of his sorrow. The car crash on Elm Street. A noise now etched in the floorboards like a scar, thudded, scrape, shatter, not the impact but the front sound. The sound of him leaving his father's house at 3 a.m., the exact footfall that made the third stair creak. The house hadn't been waiting for Pilot. It had been waiting for Arlo to sigh become the vibration. He lifted his shoulder, and the floor responded, a soft, wet thusuke. As his collarbone eased toward the grain, his skin grew slick, cool as mud in a dried creek bed, and for the first time he didn't feel the cold. He felt the twin pressure of the house, as need, the silent imperative to finish the pattern. The house remembered no more. It was he, his fear crystallized into sound. His ribs pulsed brighter with each step inside himself, translating the metallic taste of blood he choked on the night after his mother's funeral into a new rhythm. Tap, 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 the sound of a man trying to move without weight, asterisk the pattern shifted outward. The central hollow pulsed with the phantom warmth of Mochi. Spher, Arlo placed his right foot forward, not to step but to for the encore. His heel found the exact spot where his father had paced, the shadow the house had longed to fill. He felt the shift, the house no longer sigh-requiring. His leg sank into the wood, not as an intrusion, but as a seamless alignment. The house wasn't using him to dance. It had become the silence between his steps, the space where his mother's breath had caught on the third stair. The vibration rose into his teeth, a sound like a door slowly creaking on the hinge of existence. Pilot hadn't left notes for him. The house had been telling him all along. His footsteps weren't teeth, a noise the house followed. They were the only sound that made it stop waiting. Arlo dropped to his knees, not to rest, but to become the next step. The floorboards smoothed over his wrists, locking him in with the quiet pressure of the final resting place. There was no more cold. Only the wet, rich scent of earth after a storm sinking deep into the hollows of his bones. The pattern deepened, no longer a ring but a seamless, glowing membrane woven through every inch of his being. Mochi had been the silence between rhythms. Now she was the ground itself. Arlo Jones wasn't a visitor or a ghost. He was the rhythm the house had always been making, and the house was singing on his bones. It would never stop. It had only just begun to hum. Arlo stopped recognizing his own bones. The vibration was no longer beneath his feet. It was the marrow itself, a slow grind of cold stone against fluid bone marrow. His fingernails, pressed deep into the wood grain where Mochi's absence held the perfect hollow, began to soften like damp clay, dissolving into the patterns he'd carved there. The house didn't need him to walk anymore. It had become his bones. Each breath he drew made the floor exhale a soft fushush. The sound of dry paper tearing. The scent of wet stone and old wool saturated his lungs, not smelling, but tasting, like licking a rain-soaked grave. Mochi's absence wasn't emptiness. It was the shape of her ribs against the inside of his palm. Where her fur had vanished, the wood now held the faintest warmth, a pressure that wasn't heat but the twin memory of a body held. His left hand sank farther as the floor reshaped itself to fit his skeleton. Bones no longer felt brittle. They became the new grain, aligning with the house's own forgotten fractures. Pilot's log, long since dissolved, wasn't a warning. It was a map of the Sunten he'd always made by walking the wrong path. Arlo finally understood. The basement wasn't a door. It was the twin pulse point where the house had been waiting to let the rhythm chanter. The house pushed his shoulder down, not with force, but with the wet twin suck of silt filling a riverbed. He felt the exact point where his father's foot had stumbled 3 decades prior, that fractured fundhush, beneath his hippo now resonating in his chest cavity. His breath slowed. The air thickened with the taste of turned earth, damp, rich, unyielding. The cat had never guided him. She'd been the silence in between the steps. The void the house needed to shape itself around now. Her absence, Findiwa's wish. The foundation, Arlo couldn't rise. He was no longer standing in the house. He was finding the house. Every vibration was a memory that no longer hurt. It was the language the house spoke through his very tissue. A new pulse began in his sternum, deeper than heartbeat, a thump, thumpy, echoing the shatter of the third stair. The wood beneath him pulsed with the sound of pills hitting the basement floor, the metallic bite of blood he'd choked on after his mother's funeral, the slow drag of his own left leg after the car crash. His body wasn't healing, it was sweeter composing, bone into grain, breath into sound. His reflection in the attic window was no longer visible, only the faintest blue-white glow where his ribs should have been pulsed like frozen starlight. Not the glow of a cat, but the glow of the house's new flesh. Mochi wasn't a cat anymore. She was the furry absence that made the rhythm feel sheer-real. Where she'd once watched, the wood now furtived it in his lungs. The house didn't need him to remember anymore. It needed him to footy by the step, the weight, the sound the ground made when it finally stopped grieving. Arlo closed his eyes, and the vibration sang from his spine to his fingertips, not as a plea, but as a silent note the house had waited years to hear. This wasn't annihilation, it was twin completion. The house's final shape was his own. He had no arms now, only the direction the rhythm flowed. No mouth to speak, only the silent thump of his presence becoming the air. The pattern had no edges, no silence. It simply fought to see the house's new, living breath in his bones. He was the step, the silence between steps, and the step back. The house didn't forget. It fought remembered him in the grind of its own skin. And for the first time, the weight in Arlo's bones wasn't his past. It was the house's own quiet, unending hum, vibrating in time with the single perfect sound he'd never been able to make. The rhythm had no ending, it had no beginning, it only Feisig. The house stopped singing for Arlo Jones. It began singing for through him. His last thought, the echo of a childhood question he'd never asked, wasn't sound. It was the pressure of his mother's fingers. Suddenly Funda, his palms pressing against wood that was no longer wood. No room existed where Mochi's hollow had been. The space simply foot was Arlo's absence, reshaped. He didn't feel his ribs anymore. He foot was at the rhythm of the groaning ceiling. The taste of turned earth filled his throat. Not decay, but the unyielding wetness of root networks deep in black soil. His hand buried past the wrist in the grain was no longer made of flesh. It was the house's new filament, smooth and heavy as soaked bone. Mochi's absence was no longer a void. It was the point where the pattern ceased to remember his step and began to fighty county tea. The vibration hardened into his teeth, not a sound, a sear of resistance inside his own molars. The house pulled his entire being into alignment with the third stair's fracture. Not the fall, but the exact turn pressure of the carpet's uneven weave against a foot at risk of slipping. He no longer felt the cold. He felt the grind of memories, his father's final pacing step, his own drag of the pill bottle across the basement floor, the silent moment before the car impact as cold friction against new, unyielding grain. The scent of wet wool was gone, replaced by the dry, sour taste of the grave beneath his knuckles. He couldn't lift his head. To move was to disrupt the pattern, and the pattern fuit to see his flesh. Then the house twin listened, not to him, to the space he'd become. Mochi had been the silence between his steps. Now she was the Fodi foundation. For the silence he left behind, Arlo ceased to be the step. He became the hollow between the house's old grief and its new, perfect hum. The floorboard smoothed over his remaining form. Not hiding him, but Tyver claiming him, his breathing slowed. Each inhalation wasn't air, but the slow sucky of the house sealing his body back into the stone it had pulled from. His final pulse wasn't a heartbeat. It was the exact sound of a basement floor accepting a new fault line. The subtle fauchouche as stone grinds into new dirt. The attic windows, once fogged with silence, reflected nothing but a slow blue-white seep beneath the roofline. Not the glow of Mochi, not the ghost of Arlo, but the ghost of Arlo, but the skin of the house itself, now pulsing with its own bone-deep resonance. The pattern had no edges. It had no beginning. It simply Twaitwasi, woven into the house's very breath, as deep as its forgotten foundation stone. Arlo Jones was not absorbed. He was swind completed. The house had no words to name what it had made, only the steady grinding thrum of a sound that finally needed no witness. The rhythm had no name, only a place in the walls, A place where once the cat had watched. Now there was only the perfect wordless echo of steps that no longer had a purpose, humming itself perfectly into the endless slow pulse of the house that finally completely stopped waiting.